Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Tripwire Energy Working Group Virtual Edition. I'm Liz Fox, Marketing Events Manager at Tripwire, and I'm excited to be part of this week's event. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This is a multi-day event, and all of the sessions are listed on the agenda page online. You should have received a link for that in your email, which is probably how you got here. Some of you may have had a chance to download calendar invites with links for each session if you registered before yesterday afternoon. But if not, the agenda page now has live links for you to also access each session. And just in case you get lost, we've also linked the agenda page at the bottom of each session in the console. It's a little electrical tower in the bottom right-hand corner. We've also incorporated a group chat function this year, so if you'd like to chat with your fellow attendees, you can find the group chat widget at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers, Alex and Patrick, who are here on the line, will remain on the line after the presentation. So make sure you put any questions into the Q&A widget, and the same goes for any of the other sessions this week. If you are experiencing technical difficulties during the event, please make sure to click on the help widget at the bottom of your screen. Also, feel free to type a question into the Q&A, and I can try to help you out. So other than that, we're really looking forward to spending some time with you all this week. Please let us know if you need anything during the event. You can feel free to do so by responding to any of the emails that you've received about the event. So now I'd like to turn things over to our VP of Industrial Sales, Alex Bagwell. So take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for joining us. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As Liz stated, my name is Alex Bagwell. I'm a Vice President of Industrial Sales at Tripwire, and I would like to welcome you all to our annual Energy Working Group. Every year we host this event, and I'm always excited to see the hundreds of attendees we have across the US, Canada, and Latin America join us. We know that investing 3 days into Tripwire is a lot to ask, but I know by our final presentation you will have a better understanding of Tripwire across informational technology, operational technology, our best practices not only by our Tripwire team, but also some of your peers. And we'll also be able to see and share a lot of what we're seeing and responding to in the marketplace. While I was hoping to host this year's Energy Working Group in person for 2021, we recognize that with this past year's events and increasing variants that it would be best to keep this event virtual. Unfortunately, we all recognize that this has forced us to essentially do our jobs differently, learn differently, and respond differently. So while I also recognize Zoom fatigue is real, I'm glad you all have decided to spend the next few days with us, albeit virtually. As Liz had alluded to and started off, right, this week we have a packed agenda of rich information and hearing from some incredible people inside and also outside of Tripwire. We'll be covering a range of topics from products, peer reviews, tips and tricks on some of our solutions, and Liz has spoken a little bit about it. Do not hesitate to ask questions, right? There is a box in the bottom right-hand corner that you all can select, a control panel along the bottom as well. If you have questions, feel free to insert those into the Q&A text box, and each one of the presenters, he or she, will be leaving some time towards the end to respond. So to round out some of my opening statements, right, I recognize you all have a choice to be here. I thank the over 280 of you that decided to join Tripwire this morning and over the next few days, right? We're all excited to have you, and we're also very excited to have our keynote speaker today, right? So starting us off, I'd like to introduce everyone to Mr. Patrick Miller. Patrick is the CEO of Ampere Industrial Security. He has over 30 years of IT and OT experience through his consulting services in security and regulatory advisor for critical infrastructure and key resource organizations. Patrick is also the U.S. coordinator for the Industrial Cybersecurity Center, or CCI, as well as the founder, president, and currently serves on the board of directors for the Energy Sector Security Consortium. Patrick is an internationally recognized public speaker on the subjects of critical infrastructure protection, process and industrial control systems cybersecurity, information and OT technology cybersecurity, and is one of the leading experts in NERC SIP, audit, and privacy. So I am excited for Patrick to host this year's keynote. And with that, Patrick, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And very glad to be here. Thanks everyone for your time. I'll go ahead and get started. Let's make sure we get our slides to the right spot. There we go. I'm going to talk about the state of cybersecurity in the electric utility industry. This is my home. I come out of the utility space originally in telecom, and then, of course, water and electric for the most amount of time. I'm not going to belabor this. I like to say I'm a recovering regulator. I'm ex-utility, and I've done a lot of other extracurricular things as well in the space. So I'll start us off with kind of the obligatory slide of the threat landscape, that kind of thing. I'll keep this short and sweet, but I'd like to at least confirm some things for you. Yes, infrastructure is a target for various reasons and various motivations. So, whether it's an actual nation state or organized crime or, even ourselves, we have essentially infrastructure is definitely a considered target. It's a high value target for a lot of reasons. So, whether you've got a nation state that will actually take action and try to cause, for example, a blackout or a disturbance versus just gaining access to it, neither one of those things are something that we would desire. The reality is you've got some very, not necessarily always sophisticated, but you have some adversaries that have three things you don't, and that's people, money, and time. And you don't necessarily need sophistication if you have those three things. Either way, your ability to defend yourself against some of these things is going to be severely strained, if not impossible in some cases. One of the key pieces that I'm seeing is, especially around the supply chain discussions, is we basically buy all of our gear from the same vendors. So whether you're, a nation that's South America, North America, Europe, Asia, we're all buying our products from the same vendors, and basically the only difference is the manual comes in your language. Other than that, it's all the same stuff. So that gets into some interesting and unique supply chain situations we'll talk about. I do believe attribution is getting better. So we're getting better at knowing where the attack came from and who did it. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it used to be a lot harder than it is now. And we're getting at least a little bit higher degree of confidence in saying this is the source or, sources, and getting that kind of forensic attribution component is getting much better. We are also beginning to see some cyber warfare, some cyber espionage, and believe it or not, even prosecution. There are some norms that are starting to form. And at least the discussion on norms is happening, and it's no longer just kind of the Wild West. So if I had a crystal ball, every time we have a catalytic event, so think, of course, I hate to use these examples because they're so overused, of course, but like Oldsmar and even the Colonial Pipeline situation, every one of these incidents, whether they were a real OT attack or not, the perception of the attack causes this little cyber avalanche of things. And everyone freaks out and they get their hair on fire. And the immediate reaction in a lot of cases is to regulate. And part of that is because NERC SIP happened, and it did actually move the needle. And it moved the needle in some cases. It made some things worse. I mean, I've been knee deep in this since it started, believe it or not, since 2001. It's been that long. We've been doing this for 20 years. But, it's always held up as the example of, well, NERC SIP would have stopped this, or that wouldn't happen in the electric sector because of NERC SIP. Again, whether that's true or not, it is still the example. It's always being used as the thing that kind of saved the day. So as such, regulation is often looked at as the solution. And I'm not a proponent of a lot of regulation. I think especially fast regulation is bad regulation. But nonetheless, we have legislators, regulators, state commissions. They're asking lots of questions, and they've been asking questions for a long time. They're actually getting smarter on this. They're not where they need to be, right? But they're getting smarter. They're asking better questions. They're getting more information. They're still not getting it perfect, but what we're seeing at least is just in this last session, 18 new cybersecurity bills. That's above and beyond what we've seen by a long shot, right, in the past. And some of these actually stand some chance of making it through. So some of the real world examples of just, not just a legislative avenue, but even the existing regulations, the global landscape, in Europe over, across the pond, essentially, we've got the NIS. In the UK, we've got the CAF. In Germany, we've got the BSI. Of course, much of Europe uses 62443. South America does too. In the US and North America, we use NIST 800 series, of course, 53 and 82. And then the cybersecurity framework in general. and also NERC. These are just some of the things that are out there. There are far more. I could have a whole dedicated, presentation on just the global landscape of regulation in infrastructure across the world. We also have the FERC RFI that came out recently. It's a request for information. It essentially was around market incentives. At the same time, it was asking about possibly moving some things more toward NIST 800 series and identified some areas where SIP did not have controls in that same space. The recent 100-day plan, of course, we're past the 100-day plan. The 100 days is passed for the electric sector. This was under the Biden administration to get some more kind of monitoring and detection and information sharing going. The ESC2M2 just got another version, and it looks good. We're now, at the next wave of being able to take a look at how this has worked in the industry and how it can be used and get better. So the ESC2M2 is out, the new version, and it's doing well. The ONGC2M2 has also been there for a while. It looks a lot like the other one, but what I'm seeing is these are being used by, in lieu of any other measurement other than like NERC, they're being used by commissions, state commissions, and then even insurance underwriters as forms of measurement of your organization. There's been a lot of movement in the TSA pipeline area, of course, as a response to Colonial. The guidelines were updated. There's been 2 separate sets of directives basically set out. And then there's the API 1164 is even being promoted as another option to kind of give a full suite of controls, but something like NERC for the gas space in addition to the TSA stuff. And then, of course, just recently we had the DHS issuing through CISA the ICS attack history. So they're highlighting these areas where the industrial control systems have been hacked so that there's proof, and it shows that this is a legitimate concern, a legitimate issue. And this is clearly trying to signal and set the tone for both asset owners and for regulators or legislators that this is a reality. And then, of course, we just had some recent updates to the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards in the chemical sector. And then, of course, just a rash of executive orders out of the last 2 administrations and even the prior administrations. So the last 3 administrations have had cybersecurity executive orders. And then we just got something new called a National Security Memorandum. And I'll talk about that one for just a minute because it's fairly new and it's a little bit different. So I thought it warranted a little focus. So with the National Security Memorandum, it's not a law, it's not a regulation. It is, as it says, a voluntary collaborative initiative. And I've got for now in parentheses on purpose. There's a lot of discussion about this. It is asking for essentially a baseline set of security controls across all infrastructure sectors. And they start with electric, gas, water, and chemical. And there's the I guess, ostensible kind of signaling that they're going to be pushing into all of the sectors. I'm not sure they'll reach all 16, but they'll probably do most of them, at least for some set of measurement, at least for those that have industrial control systems. Some of those controls that they're looking for is that baseline set of security controls. Those will be common with some of the existing frameworks like SIP, like the TSA stuff. Control frameworks are essentially all the same. The controls, you just kind of mix them up and put them into different buckets and call them something else. Controls are all basically the same kind of controls. It's not like there's a lot of, significant difference. They're just kind of packaged in different ways. So there is a lot of commonality around them. Of course, it's being signaled so far that 882, which of course is an overlay of 853, is being promoted to be the set as that kind of common set of baseline security controls. It's currently in revision for draft 3 for 882. Draft 5 of 853 just came out not too long ago. So currently, there's not going to be enforcement of this voluntary collaborative initiative. We haven't quite heard how it's going to get measured yet. They have named the group in CISA that will essentially manage this. NIST is going to provide the measurements, and then we'll call it the measurements will be monitored by CISA. They've got a group. They don't have funding yet. Their funding kicks in January. So right now there's a lot of planning, positioning, staffing, those kinds of things, getting ready for what's going to happen. I've been asking, and I can't get any clear understanding yet of how they're going to measure. I'm not sure they're ready for this question just yet. So is it going to be an audit? Is it going to be an assessment? Is it going to be some sort of like self-reporting structure? What will this look like? How will they measure? We're not sure yet. So kind of keep your eyes peeled for that. Again, after the beginning of the year, I'm sure we'll start to see a lot more clear direction and clear focus on what this is going to look like. It will first, of course, apply to the electricity subsector, and that's primarily because there's already the 100-day plan that came out that laid the groundwork for this. And a lot of this is not brand new, right? There's a big, giant kind of machine behind all of this that's been moving for some time. And this is really the culmination of various different efforts coming together under a single initiative to start getting a little more traction. Of course, electric first, then gas, and then chemical and water. One of the ones that I thought was interesting is, at least in the electric sector, there's a very clear line around distribution being off limits for the federal space. One kind of eminent domain stretch or reach that they can use is this national security label. And that gives them the ability to get into areas that they traditionally have no jurisdiction, right? Especially through like FERC's jurisdiction primarily. That's the hard line between, of course, the generation space and transmission space, and then the distribution space, which is reserved for states' rights. This may give them a little bit more reach into distribution, and that's already been signaled in one of the executive orders prior for supply chain as well. So it's clear that this is at least an area where they're experimenting with their ability to influence the security in that space. Of course, the final framework, the initial framework was set to be issued by September 22nd. We've already gotten signal that it's going to be 882, so we'll probably see something more formal before September 22nd of this year. And then by July 28th of next year, everything has to be laid out in a formal program. So we'll know, the agencies, the monitoring structure, the measurement guide, what that's going to look like. And then, of course, there's a lot of kind of motions and signals that this is voluntary, but participation is expected. And I think it comes down to participate or else, right? Real regulation will come afterward if we don't do this. So what do I need to do, right? What does it actually say? And these are quotes directly out of the National Security Memorandum, or the NSM. Deployment of technologies. They want you to install stuff. You need to buy something and install it. If you already have it, great. But this stuff needs to provide threat, and I've got and anomaly because that's kind of it's been the kind of, I guess, natural naming convention is anomaly detection systems. But they want threat and anomaly, visibility, indications, detections, and warnings. So they want you to be able to see into your environment and provide some sense of situational awareness, right? Would you know if a bad actor was in your environment? That's kind of the big question. And then, of course, response capability. So then what do you do if there's a bad actor in your environment? Ransomware has also led this, not just, the potential nation state kind of coming in and gaining access and having, quote unquote, their finger on the button, which of course, has been, I guess, at least stated in some media outlets. The other piece is ransomware, really. That's where this response capabilities comes from. It's not just could you respond to a bad actor in your environment, it's could you respond to ransomware and keep it from causing, significant disruption. And then, of course, government and industry to collaborate. This is the perpetual, hopes and prayers for the information sector is always, more information sharing is expected and required. Traditionally, as we've seen, this has been a lot of information gets shared with the government and very little comes back. So they're trying to say that situation will get better and that they will be better partners in that relationship and provide a lot more, we'll call it assistance and indicators, other things that are supposed to benefit the asset owners during the response component. And then, of course, baseline security goals, as I mentioned, that's kind of the across all sectors. So they're looking for a common set of measurements and minimum set of measurements for control systems across all sectors as well. So what do you need to do, like, in response to this, right? So you're a utility and you're wondering, do I need to do anything? And granted, this is voluntary, so you could tell them go away if you want to. And we'll talk about that as well. But if as a consultant, my initial recommendations on this, given what we know at this point in time, if you're ready to be an early adopter and you think you're in a good position, I would start with a gap assessment of your current SIP controls against 853 and 82. This has already been mapped. It's been mapped to the cybersecurity framework. There's plenty of existing ways to do the Venn diagram overlap of your SIP controls to the 853 and 82 controls. I would start with that. So at least you know what your gaps are, right? Because you're going to get effectively kind of voluntarily voluntold to measure against this new standard, not new, but at least as a guideline to do it now. And then, of course, create an action plan to remediate any control gaps. Write down what your plan is. And, of course, an action plan from an outside auditor-based perspective is there's an owner, there's an action, there's a date for getting it done, and then there's budget allocated to actually getting it done. And, a lot of that includes budget being also resources as well. If you need to do any architecture or system modifications needed to increase that monitoring detection component, and I'll talk about this. It's in everybody's regulation now. It's in everybody's push. It's in all the guidelines. There is a very, very strong push to have this visibility into your environment. And the kind of security telemetry that you're getting out of your environment is now kind of becoming a measure of your security posture. So if you need to do any architecture or system designs, this can take a long time in industrial control system environments, because in some cases, this may mean you got to do it during a scheduled outage, right? Or if, God forbid, you get an unscheduled outage. So this has to be done with a lot of planning and care and thoughtfulness. So start as early as you can on that component, unless you can just drop some taps in and maybe make some configurations on the fly and not have any operational impact. And then, of course, you got to procure or tune, if you already own some of those existing network anomaly detection components. In the IOU space, there's a lot of CRISP. In the uni space, there's a lot of neighborhood keeper. In the rural space or the co-op space, there's Essence. There's a lot of options out there already on that side. There's a lot of organizations that are already deploying their own tools. In no order or preference, you're going to see like a Dragos Clarity, Nozomi, Forescout, any of those components as well. Getting that additional security, the network-based security telemetry, and then of course you want the system-based telemetry, as much of that as you can get to get that picture. That's the expectation. And then the main thing is, if you put all the security cameras in and you've got nobody watching them or no analytics, then you've wasted your money and your time. They do know that does take people and something like a security operations function. This can be outsourced, it can be insourced, but you probably need to do something around that. Having that visibility and doing nothing about it really is frankly a waste of time. And then, of course, that process, analyze, respond, tune, that's the hard part, is that kind of lather, rinse, repeat of making sure those tools are doing what they're supposed to do in a meaningful way, and they're not just, blinky lights heating up the data center. And the last piece, of course, is perform a real incident response and recovery exercise, and we'll talk about what that means. What is a real one? It's beyond just a paper exercise on the table. It should look like something that is going to severely impact your operations. And of course, this is voluntary. It's not mandatory, right? You can tell, like I said, you can tell them to go away. But let's talk about some of the, what's the downside, right? If you just do nothing. And I speak with a lot of boards and a lot of executives. So these are some of the items that I use, at least to help understand what are some of the downsides. Of course, it's up to you to accept your own risks. Obviously, there's a PR incentive or a hit either way. And if this sets the public perception minimum, right, if this is what the general public, especially the media and others like insurance agencies or even venture capital or other credit rating organizations see it as the minimum bar, and you're not meeting it, that could have a perception benefit or a hit, whether you met it or not. Cyber insurance impacts can be very real. I've talked to several insurers now and underwriters. They're not kidding. They're actually extremely up to speed. They're asking intelligent questions. They're getting into the protocols. They're actually looking at really detailed components before they'll actually underwrite a policy for you. And of course, your level of protections and your caps and all of those components will be based on kind of what you are doing and compared to the norms that are out there. This can affect business partnerships, whether it's upstream, downstream. Of course, M&A diligence always comes into question. And then, of course, contracts. You may not be able to get a contract done without showing that you can at least meet some of these things, or you've certified yourself against it in some way or at testing. And then, of course, constrained markets is a big one. So if you do this late at the last minute, you're going to end up with what you get. You're going to have fewer consultants that cost more, possibly things like hardware-based constraints, just because of laws of supply and demand, right? And then, of course, early adopter bonus points. If you do this early and you communicate early on, you're going to look like you're a better player in the space, a better player in the sector. Whatever your oversight body is, they're going to feel better about your approach. So you get some more of those additional chips that you may need to play at a later time. Easier to demonstrate proactive continuous improvement, right? If you start earlier, even if it's at a minimum line, then you get to show awesome improvements going forward from that point on. Versus kind of waiting to the last second to see where you are and then having to hopefully not turn the battleship in the bathtub. You don't want to do those late stage, time constrained, kind of forced reactive efforts. They look bad in a lot of ways. And then, of course, the situational gravity is regulation may be inevitable. So why not go ahead and position yourself for it now? There's a very high likelihood, given everything that's out there, that this will at least be in some way, shape, or form mandatory at some point. And then, of course, if not this national security memorandum, there's a whole bunch of other influences that should drive you to do this. And just in case you're not believing the fact that this is likely going to be regulation at some point, here's some direct signaling out of the press briefing that came out the night before the National Security Memorandum was released. And basically it says we're going to start with voluntary and then pursue all options we have, which basically means, do it or else. And then, of course, committed to addressing the limited piecemeal regulation. They know that in our space, the regulation is very, it's not necessarily broken, but it only covers so many things through so many angles. And some things are regulated, some things are not, some things are federal, some things are state, some things have threshold, like your bulk electric system, or even high, medium, and low within NERC SIP. So it's not, it isn't a one size fits all or even most. It's varied and piecemeal in their own words. And then basically it says, we will look to you to implement this. That is the expectation again. The good thing is at least there's some common solution threads. So you've already done NERC SIP, you can borrow a lot of that. And there are other control frameworks. If you've done 62443, or if you're already doing some of the other NIST components, or anything else that you've already done already that's a qualified control framework, even things like COVID, COSO, all of those things can benefit here again, because it's just yet another controls framework, right? You just pick those other controls and map them over here. In a lot of cases, the mappings have been done. There are some portable skill sets in OT. So, if you've got NERC SIP skills and you're already doing some controls there, you can do the same thing over here in an IT as well as for, we've got, things like if you're embracing ITIL or COVID COSO, you're already well prepared to manage this. And then there's some common solutions, at least for IT and OT, both in the hardware and software space. So if it works for NERC SIP, it's going to work for 882 in a lot of cases. There's very few things that won't do both. So there really isn't a lot of, personnel skill set change or technology change if you already have some of these things in place. So what's the forecast, right? It really is going to be something like the new normal is basically, these are the common threads I'm seeing across all of the rash of executive orders, directives, memorandums, proposed legislature, you name it. Whether it's coming from direct regulation or indirect, what I call kind of transitive regulation, or just norms that get imposed. The supply chain is a big one. And then, of course, knowing the security posture of all the assets and knowing those assets, right? Asset inventory is key. Segmenting and restricting access. I hate zero trust because it means so many different things. But of course, MFA at boundaries and strong boundary preventions and strong boundary control for remote access. Monitoring and detection, it's everywhere. Incident response, of course, with ransomware, this is a very, very key. And then, of course, also ransomware is recovery in the event that you actually need to. And everyone keeps asking, when is this all going to stop? We can't figure out what to do next. I would argue that this actually gives you less guessing. These are the things that are common throughout all of these components. If you at least get these things figured out and you're doing okay in these areas, you're much better positioned to take whatever comes your way. They're not coming at you with some brand new security thing that you have to do that hasn't already been said somewhere somehow. But these are the common kind of centers of gravity that we're seeing across the board in all of them. So this actually takes away some of the guesswork. If you do these things, you will likely be doing the right stuff early on. So quick discussion on assets and architecture. Do you have an asset inventory, right? And this doesn't mean everything. And managing every single asset is an insanely daunting task. But could you at least do that critical stuff? And not just the NERC SIP critical stuff, but the other critical stuff that you need to do, those things that have, if you're mature enough or you're far enough along, you've done a true business impact assessment, or BIA, you know what you need to operate, those processes that are necessary. If you've got that, at least do the asset inventory on those things. And then, of course, if you do an asset inventory and you don't do change management, well, you've wasted your time. You're going to get drift fairly quickly. Yes, even in the OT space, it does change enough to where over time you will definitely get drift that will cause problems. Do you have an environment you can defend, right? This is the architecture component. If it's not, we've gone from getting the architecture designed purely for reliability. We've started looking at designing the architecture for, reliability and some security components, and it was largely with prevention in mind. But we haven't really thought about designing it with prevention, detection, and response in mind. So designing an architecture that is easily defendable becomes a different discussion. And this runs counter, you'll see the bottom one of the interdependencies. A lot of the stuff that's being talked about, and it's a very difficult discussion. Of course, segmented networks, we're good with that. One-way traffic, we're really good with that one too. Multi-factor authentication, strict mode access controls, yes, NERC, SIP, jump hosts, we're pretty good at that too. It's this one, it's the shear lane networks or crumple zones or intelligent islanding. How would you be able to segment off the important stuff so that it could continue to run without dependencies on components on the outside, which runs absolutely counter to what we've been doing for many cases. We're trying to consolidate a lot of this stuff so that we can buy one vendor, one platform, run multiple operations. I've even seen, water SCADA and electric SCADA run from the same system in the same control center with really just different AORs and different HMIs. So this would be very difficult to kind of untie all of that and separate it into zones that, if needed, could be kind of intelligently islanded into these little spots. And this is, of course, in response to the Colonial pipeline, which, as reported, they shut down the OT, not because it was affected by the ransomware, but because the IT side, it affected the billing systems, and effectively there were processes that were going to be so impactful to the organization if they let the operation side continue to run that it would be, detrimental or catastrophic. So in this case, it was IT process that affected OT. It had nothing to do with hacking the OT environments or actually getting ransomware in the OT space at all. So it's that kind of interdependencies that can also have the impacts that are now under discussion and will likely at least have some, if not signaling or as I call transitive regulation, real regulation. And of course, this discussion, monitoring is everywhere. Every single thing I see coming forward has, do you have visibility into your environment at the system and at the network level? Some of these systems don't allow installation of agents, so you're stuck with getting network space where you can. You might be able to log into it and get at least a firmware or a log out of it. You can do that with some other components that don't just listen on the wire, that you can actually, like with Tripwire, for example, will do that. But you need to know with sufficient confidence if there was or was not an adversary in your system. That is the question. This is very hard to do depending on the adversary. But if you don't at least do something to show you're trying and you're meeting kind of the expected minimum, or you're in the center of the herd of wildebeest, at least with this approach, that will be called out and will likely have some significant, I will say, influence on your operation. And monitoring, of course, like I mentioned, Crest, neighborhood keeper essence, those are at least the ones that are being pushed from the outside. A lot of organizations have bought additional tools on the inside. But the reality is things like, I call them smoke detectors, are going to be required in your building code. So if you try to build the building, you need smoke detectors, you need sprinklers in some cases, you need fire extinguishers in some cases, and even the insurance will not process a claim if you don't have them. So you're getting hit from all sides to actually implement these components. And then, as I mentioned, regulation, insurance, diligence, reporting. You may end up having to report some of this stuff through a data breach reporting regulation. In the event that happens, if you are unable to report enough sufficient data, that's going to be a problem. So it's starting to look at that as a reality. It's likely going to happen at some point. Do you have enough visibility into your environment to actually satisfy that request or requirement? And then, of course, as I mentioned, you got to start where you can. Start with the critical stuff, start with the critical alarms, the critical security monitoring components, and then kind of as you get that down and you get it tuned, then to add additional things over time to get your wider visibility with better tuning. And then, of course, this is based on solid asset inventory. If you didn't do a good asset inventory for that stuff, it's going to be really challenging to have a picture here. And then, of course, it feeds into the next one, which is response and recovery. This is all kind of your chain. In the mix of all of this is supply chain. NERC SIP, of course, was the tip of the iceberg. It was a fast regulation. It's poorly written. It's effectively regulating your vendors by proxy through the industry. All of that is a real pain in the neck. Nonetheless, it exists and it's out there and you're required to do it. That said, it's as these audits start to unfold and we start to see kind of where at least the audit thresholds are and the audit norms in terms of findings and approaches, we'll get a better understanding. But in addition to all of that, we've seen this in executive orders, multiple executive orders. And it's been on the telecom side. It's been on of course, the actual physical equipment side, which didn't have much cyber really in it at all. We're looking at things like transformers and other components there that, at best, it's going to have some sensing capability that's digital. Nonetheless, we're seeing all of it there. And there's likely more to come as we get further into the relationship with China. China just recently had a bunch of issuances around vulnerability disclosure and software control. And if you sell to China, you have to give China specific information. So this may end up driving additional executive orders around supply chain components, specifically with them, just because of the practices that they've just so recently introduced. It will get worse and more challenging there. But as such, you're seeing technology, players pop up in South Korea and even in Europe and Eastern Europe. So there at least are some market responses to those for options. And then in these executive orders, we're seeing things like no-buy lists. And there's always the discussion of, do you have to rip and replace, which would be insanely challenging and would have direct impact on the system. You would cause blackouts to prevent blackouts by having to have an unscheduled outage to replace something, for example. There's the legacy risk, which of course is often unaddressed. Just, if it's net new going forward, then you still have the legacy issues to deal with, which is on you as a utility. The made in, if it's just one of our friendly nations, is it a friendly nation today, but maybe it's not a friendly nation tomorrow? We have no idea what the landscape looks like in terms of politics. But are we going to really just take the outside, made in label, because in a lot of cases it was just assembled there, and the underlying components often get into question, which leads into the next one: is really how far do you go, and how far is demonstrably enough? So if you have to justify where you stopped on how far you went in your risk management for supply chain, what is good enough? And that's a very slippery question, and we don't have a lot of good answers on it right now. We do know at least the best thing we can find is, at least if you're managing things like a hardware bill of materials or a software bill of materials or a firmware bill of materials, these things are discussed as kind of the best shot for your minimum bar or your norm at the moment. So SBOMs are the one that get the most attention right now, and I would at least pay attention to those and get something that you can do around it. There's some good tools out there that can at least get you started with SBOM right now. There is discussion of things like what I call CyberStar, which is kind of like that Energy Star rating for appliances, right? It gives like a security rating for any piece of equipment, which anybody in the space knows that is an absolute snapshot for a moment in time, and it can change literally seconds after it gets the rating. But nonetheless, this is being discussed and will likely be rated under something like a UL or some similar kind of thing. But what does go a long way is well, back up. I haven't seen a lot of traction on transparency centers. Several vendors have tried to set up transparency centers where you can actually come in, review the code, look under the hood, kick the tires. That's great, but most of what I'm seeing in terms of benefit is certification, right? Whether you're ISO certified, it's verified through some third party, you can prove there's been assessments done, that kind of thing goes a long way. And then, of course, all of this is frustrating. You're asking the vendors for things, and if all, let's just say all 3,500 plus utilities, though some of them are too small to really, impact much. But if all of them went to the vendors and asked different questions about different things about the same products, you're still going to end up with an overwhelming tsunami for those vendors to try to respond to. So they're trying to respond in a meaningful way that is as best they can, with at least some common answers for many, and then do the one-offs as for areas where they've got uniqueness or differences in their baseline. But nonetheless, it's very frustrating, and it makes the costs go up for everybody involved. Response and recovery, practice like it's game day. I mean, you really have to mean it, because it could very likely be you tomorrow. It was a very real situation for Colonial, if you ask the people that did the incident response on the inside. So when did you do a real incident response exercise? Did it include something like where you take it all the way to recovery and actually recover something, right? Versus just do a tabletop and say, then we would recover and then finish the pizza and leave and write up your lessons learned. Did it include something like what happened in Colonial? Because now this is yet another incident that you should probably factor in. Did an IT process impact OT? Did something on the IT side impact your OT environments as well? In the TSA directives, for example, they actually specifically mention IT and OT in the same sentence for the directives that they're stating. So it's not unrealistic that this could at some point creep its way into the power space as well. Everything else you've done leads up to this, right? Your asset inventory, your supply chain components, your segmentation, your monitoring, all enables your ability to respond and recover in a more meaningful way, faster time, faster root cause analysis, more surgical recovery components. All of those things can play into this. The better you're doing everything else, the better you're going to be at this, right? So they all lean into each other. And then, of course, you can borrow from operations. Operations is good at this. They're used to dealing with outage. They're used to dealing with, freak out mode and then figuring it out quickly. Safety is also a really good spot. So, bring them into the discussion on all of this. They should be part of the mix, because you're going to need them when it does go south one day really bad. And of course, the question is, could you really go to manual? I hear it all the time. Well, if things get real bad, we'll go to manual. Really? For how long? How long can you actually do that? And could you really go to manual? That's something you should definitely investigate before you throw that out there as an option, because it's getting more and more challenging by the day to actually do this. And then, of course, you can expect oversight when it happens, and I got that in quotes because it will not feel good. There's this cyber NTSB that's promoted as an independent kind of response body. CISA, EISAC, FBI. You might even have like Commerce and Department of State involved, believe it or not. There's a likely, lots of hands will want access to this information if something hits the critical infrastructure, especially electric. And then, of course, what happens to one utility, that cyber avalanche that happens afterward is going to affect everybody else. So if you do a bad job and you get hit, everybody else pays the price. So please kind of accept your collective responsibility in this game. NERC SIP. Let's move on to NERC SIP. The horizon, what I'm seeing for NERC SIP so far, of course, I was one of the original drafters of NERC SIP. I was the first NERC SIP auditor in the nation, set up the first program out of all the regions. WAC had the first region. That was mine, biggest region. So I've done this for a long time. Written it, audited it, and implemented it in a lot of places, and done a ton of mock audits on the outside as a consultant. But still on some guidance working groups and provide input to drafting teams. But I can say that legislators, regulators, agencies, as I mentioned earlier, they're getting wiser. They understand this. They've read it. They know what it means. We're not back in the early days where this was confusing. Everybody has a pretty clear picture of what NERC SIP does, what it covers, what it protects. It is drifting more toward NIST. You'll see specifically in the FERC RFI and in several FERC orders, they identify areas where the SIP standards don't have controls that cover areas that they want. And this is, I'm not saying they're going to directly move over to NIST immediately, but that is something you should definitely be paying attention to, because they're identifying those gaps and they're comparing the gap against NIST, specifically 853 and 882. There is some more in the supply chain stuff and general risk management and others. NIST covers a lot of areas. But if you had to focus, if you had limited resources and you had to focus on the SIP components that get you the biggest bang for the buck everywhere else in addition to SIP, I would focus on 7, 8, and 9. This, of course, is your systems-based stuff, your monitoring components, as well as your response and recovery. Those are getting a lot of attention right now. And we'll likely see some of those in your audit scopes, even though a lot of audit scopes are going down for good reasons. But we still see a lot of violations in 7. You will still see the same violation numbers in 4 and 10, just because they're very difficult ones to meet. Perfectly, 365, 24/7 every day of your life. The supply chain standards, we're seeing changes. This one is still evolving, of course. It will likely be coming to a low impact system near you. That is definitely on the table. It's being discussed. It's being worked on. And then, of course, including different components such as PACS and EACMS. And the same thing with cloud. Lots of changes there. There's the allowance of, whether it's BCSI itself or even BCS, right? Your BES cyber systems. There's discussion, at least in the latest round of standards, of could you actually virtualize them and put them in the cloud? There are writing standards that could allow for that right now. Simple answer, either, the main thing with cloud-based stuff is you probably need to hold the keys. The cloud provider can have no access to your stuff, and that would allow you to have a cloud path. That's the simplest way to put it. Yes, there's details, and yes, there's a lot of nuance to it, but that's the general kind of, that way is north for cloud. Virtualization, this one is being drafted right now. It's up for vote right now, actually, for the ballot body. So if you're interested in this, please go check it out. This one is, they've done a lot of, originally, sorry, drafting team, I'm going to be genuinely honest. The first one was terrible. It was far too confusing, complex, changed too many things. Then the latest round, they listened to a lot of the comments, and they took away a lot of the removal of definitions and changed the definitions in meaningful ways to make them a little easier to embrace for virtualization. It's still an amazing shift. It is the biggest shift since V3 to V5, like going from, binary in out to high, medium, and low, and then the applicable columns and that kind of thing. This is a big enough shift. When you see the list of standards that change, virtually every standard changes with this one as well. No pun intended. But take a look at that one. It is a very significant shift. And then, of course, global adoption. I'm seeing NERC SIP get adopted all across South America, and even in places in Europe and in Asia. And really, the only difference I'm seeing is NERC SIP, basically the SIP 2. What is critical? That's about the only thing that changes. They're adopting it by and large in whole. So this has kind of become the global norm across the board. So it's not going away, at least immediately in the US. It's still there. Yes, it's changing. It's changing in important ways like virtualization and cloud and supply chain. But just you don't want to forget about NERC SIP just because you have to look at new things like this as well. You get to do them both, unfortunately. So the non-regulatory forecast, what else is happening? And I'm going to give you a little bit of what I'm seeing in terms of a crystal ball. Time on some of this is really dependent on things like we didn't expect a pandemic to set some things back, right? So there are some, your mileage may vary on timelines for some of this, but innovation is definitely accelerating. We're seeing things where lots of really interesting, innovative components is causing disruption to the technology space. It will likely also cause disruption to our power systems at some point because we're innovating so fast. That it's really a challenge to keep all of it controlled in ways that are, you can prevent all of the potential disruptions from it. OT is looking a lot more like IT. It's just used in an OT context versus an IT context. The device is basically the same. Obviously, we're still talking, your relays and RTUs and sensors and RTACs and all that stuff is still going to be OT. It's purpose built, right? But it will be digital. Versus analog going forward. But nonetheless, it's still technology. It's all kind of becoming just T at some point. It's not going to be, perfectly all just T, but there's a lot more OT stuff looking like IT stuff. Everything you buy is digital and it's going to be connected to something else, right? That's why it's digital, is so you can get data out of it. In addition to its, capabilities from a sensing or control standpoint, digital has a lot more capacity and fine capability, but this basically increases our dependence on technology and, of course, data as well. This ends up at the end of the day where we're losing touch with our manual options, right? So if we actually had to go to like a non-digital manual approach, that would be very difficult going forward. There is a push, the consequence-based engineering. Andy Bachman has done some great work, and some others out of Idaho National Labs, Sarah Freeman as well. This concept is great. It introduces basically analog safeguards in addition to all of the awesome whiz-bang, awesome new technology stuff that we can do. So that at least you've got some physical safeguard that just is there to keep something from really getting catastrophic, in addition to all the great, cool techno stuff that you're adding. Artificial intelligence is being introduced in a lot of cases. It's still in its earlier stages, but yes, AI and ML can be smart, but they can still be hacked, right? It's just another way just to get the system to attack itself in some cases. And there's a lot of competing forces in the unregulated greenfield business in the distribution space, right? And there's also threat of regulation in distribution. If not at that interesting new creep from the federal space, states are doing it directly, right? There's regulation in California and Connecticut and New Jersey and other places where there's direct regulation on distribution space for security. So it's going to happen at some point. Now, the next one is a little more forward-looking. It's the digital transformation, convergence. There's a lot of buzzwords about this, but really it just means that you can't buy analog stuff and you have to buy digital stuff, and they're finding unique and creative ways to use that digital stuff. It all creates data. Data, of course, is being touted as the new oil. It's also the new toxic waste. It has to be managed in ways that don't become harmful, such that it is actually managed to be useful and profitable. But since everything you buy is digital and everything has a connection, what happens when all of those things have a data stream? Where does all that data go? I mean, you're now looking at different methods for just the throughput, right? Do you have the lines? Do you have the microwave? In some cases, you're limited to a twisted pair of dirty copper, depending upon the remote facility. So this will change, and of course, we'll have a lot more new options, things like your satellite cell components, and a lot of those things will give us different bandwidth options moving forward, but we'll also be able to get that data. And where is it going to go? Is it going to go to your data center? Can you expand to hold all of that? Is it going to need to go to in the cloud somewhere? Because what's going to happen is someone else is going to be able to do this faster and better than you. This isn't your core business. So you could data lake this somewhere else and then run analytical products on all of your data and do things like, let's just say you want to make an analytical product to sell, transformer data back to the transformer manufacturer because they need to find out how the operational state is versus just a failure state, because they only get data on these things really when, the component fails. But they'll buy that stuff. So you're going to look at some really interesting new revenue streams based on this data that you're getting, above and beyond just the awesome operational efficiencies that you're going to get, and reducing things like mean time between failures and preventive maintenance and rolling fewer trucks. All of that's going to happen, but you're going to find some really interesting new ways to sell this data in analytical products. And there's all kinds of new third parties that are really, that's all they do, is they take your raw data, they find interestingness and create revenue streams for you. So there is a possibility in the, possibly not too distant future that you may make as much or more money off of your data as you do pushing the electrons to actually create that data. So what do you do really if it's challenging as a utility now because you're kind of stuck with your legacy environment, everything is changing, and the regulations are all shifting. So what do you do to really embrace your future? Regulation is coming, really, it's going to be this tall to ride the ride if you're infrastructure. So at least meet that minimum bar, of course, for all infrastructure. You're likely already doing it or going above and beyond. It may go beyond NERC CIP. I don't think it's going to go beyond NERC CIP by much. If anything, it'll start creeping into the IT space, in addition to possibly including some of the OT components that were out of scope through NERC CIP. It will just, I think, if anything, it'll just increase the scope of applicability, but the control sets shouldn't expand, really too much immediately, right? Long term, probably so, but not immediately. And then, of course, regulations and standards, they do need to shift with the threats and the tech. So as the threats change, things like, we saw an OT environment impact by an IT process, okay, that's on the table now. And then, of course, as the technology changes, the vulnerabilities in those technology components and the threats to those will also change the regulations. So expect, the regulations, or as I call it, kind of transitive regulations, the norms to change as well. We are seeing control norms, like the control frameworks are all starting to kind of look like the same ingredients, just mixed up a different way and called a different dish, for both OT and IT and globally, right? So there's a lot more of this kind of centralizing and normalizing to where if you're at least doing one, you can map that to the other one, and there's not a lot of real significant shift in what you need to do. As I mentioned, technology is transforming the way we do business. You may be able to use data as a real revenue stream in addition to what you're doing, especially in the distribution space. There's a lot of opportunity there. And then, of course, the regulation is now changing as well. It's flexing not just because of the threats and for penalizing you, so to speak, or becoming the stick. There are some new options at least, in terms of allowances for virtualization and cloud, and even those new revenue streams. But some of this is being driven by the vendors, and I've actually seen utilities asking for this, and some are shocked to hear this, but it's true. But things like go to my SCADA, go to my HMI, go to my DCS, EMS, go to my PLC, believe it or not, virtualized PLCs, my digital twin, that's a thing. And vendors are offering it and selling it now. So our future is quite interesting. And with that, let's open the floor to any questions in the remaining 7 minutes.
Thanks, Patrick. We do have a few questions. Great stuff. Yeah, thank you again for walking through that. We've got a few questions here to round out the last 7 minutes. So starting with the first one, Patrick, any chance NERC CIP will be grandfathered into this voluntary NIST structure?
I think in a way, yes. Grandfathered as a regulatory component, if it becomes, mandatory, then yes, I think so. As a voluntary component, a lot of that stuff is already going to be covered in the 882. So like I mentioned, there's a little bit of differential, but not a whole lot. So but by proxy, like I said, the Venn diagram on those two things is pretty much a circle.
No, agreed. Another question is, how optimistic are you that the voluntold, maybe no formal regulation approach will result in the security posture sought by the feds?
I think if we respond in a meaningful way where we actually do the assessments and provide the feedback and we don't just give them the go away, our traditional response has always been nothing to see here, move along. And not that we're not doing great things, right? That doesn't mean we're actually not doing it. It just means leave us alone. I think we probably should at least put the olive branch out saying we're doing a lot of this. We're doing a lot of this through NERC SIP already. Here's what our differential is, and here's how we plan to fix it. If we actually all did that, I think there's a very high likelihood that since we're already regulated, they would lean off of us. And they would probably lean further into the areas that don't have mandatory and enforceable regulations. But it really depends on us. We get to kind of design our own future for that one.
No, great stuff. How are customers weighing cyber risk versus production risk? Are they opposed to each other, or are they more additive?
Great. That's a really complex question. I think it's the production risk and the cyber risk can become force multipliers upon each other. So when looked at separately, and they can be, you can't really factor one out of the other. So I would say more additive than completely separate. But I would say really, if you're looking at your full risk picture, you're looking at both in a meaningful way where you actually look at the dependencies between the two.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is where a lot of these CISOs and then OT managers or OT VPs are trying to work more closely together, right? Where in the past, It's been a lot of this, hey, I've got the IT system and the framework, let me do my thing, versus, hey, I'm trying to manage OEE, productivity, safety, quality, and output, right? Let's start blending what we're doing together versus just in separate silos.
Absolutely agree.
They're coming in now. Can you briefly touch on the Crumble Zone term you referred to in regards to the cybersecurity?
Yeah, crumple zones. Think of it when we design vehicles. There is now basically crumple zones around the outside of the car with a safety cage on the inside. It even has things like a shear away engine and drivetrain, so that if you run into somebody hard and you have a rear end collision and you're in the car rear ending the other, the engine and drivetrain will slide under the vehicle, and the front is designed to act as a cushion, crumple zone for you. So if you have other networks around the important stuff in the safety cage, those are effectively, painfully so, they're disposable, and they act as that kind of alert space and crumple space to prevent the high impact to that special safety cage zone. Best analogy I've got.
That's a great one. I like it. Might have to reuse that one. Would or will a robust asset inventory help me to address supply chain inquiries or issues?
Yes, absolutely, without question. Yeah, but your asset inventory lets them know that you at least know what you have. And from that list, assessing the risk on those components becomes, I guess, not necessarily easier, but much more quantified versus guessing and qualified. So you've got, in terms of just assurance, did you get everything? You can answer that question, which is always the very first question. How do you know you got it all? Your answer to that sets the tone for every question beyond it. So definitely so.
Agreed. We see that all the time. What is on your OT network? What is even on your IT network, right? Do you have a full log? Can we help, assess or detect, right? I think that's where, again, going back to the OT IT kind of working together, right? I have no idea as a CISO what's on my OT environment, or potentially don't know what's on my OT environment, or vice versa, right? And that asset inventory is definitely helping from that perspective. Last question here, and I'm probably the last one we'll take with the last 90 seconds or so we have. Patrick, with continuous monitoring, are there enough or qualified personnel to monitor the monitoring tool? Do you see your customers needing help or using some level of managed services?
Right. That's a really good question, because once you insert all the monitoring components, what's monitoring the monitoring environment, right? It still requires care and feeding. So in a lot of cases, the degree of maturity for the continuous monitoring is ensuring that you've got controls monitoring those monitoring components, or basically control tests that can be run. And this can be everything from heartbeats or expected flags, and all of those that are looked for with the analytical tools just to notify you when my flag is not found, right? Or my heartbeat went down. That can be done in-house, can be done out-of-house. In terms of human skill sets, not yet. I don't think we're there just yet, because this is a profoundly mundane and painful job. Really, not a lot of people want to do this for an extended period of their career. And we got to change that. We got to get better tools and better interfaces and how we front end that so that it becomes more meaningful, and they're spending less time chasing their tail and more time digging into interestingness and getting time to do things like threat hunting instead of false positive, chase down. That is going to get us to a place where they'll want to stay and they'll enjoy their job a little bit better. And then you can, again, whether you do that in-house or out of house, in-house, you're likely going to get a better return on your investment. It's much, much more expensive and it's much more challenging. I mean, just getting them is hard. Retaining them is even harder. Managing all the tools can be difficult. Outsourcing is usually where everyone gravitates. It has lower value because at the end of the day, they're going to end up calling somebody on your staff at some point, which that's a great model to start with. But that's not where I would ultimately want to end up on my maturity spectrum.
Exactly. The maturity of the customer is where we see that really transition from an outsource to an in-house, right? The more mature, more in-house versus, hey, I'm starting my journey. Can you help me with cybersecurity tools, best practices, and policies? So we are officially at the 1 o'clock time frame Eastern. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today, walking through everything. Absolutely. I know we all and the 200 or so attendees that we have right now fully enjoyed it. We did have some questions around the slide decks and being able to share them, but we can follow up with that in the future. You all, and thank you everyone for joining. We do have Patrick's information here if you want to ask further questions, or you can reach out to your local Tripwire person as well. I will ask all of you to actually close out this live event and then follow the link within your calendar invite or that Liz sent out earlier, and you guys can transition on to the next session that will start in approximately 13 to 14 minutes. Thank you again. Everyone have a great day.